Today we are in Chapter 4, Section 4, and we're going to be talking about the rise of segregation, especially in the Deep South. After Reconstruction ended, Southern states are going to begin passing laws that are going to be weakening the rights of African Americans. In this era, we kind of have to go back in time a little bit again, thinking about Reconstruction. And that was that time after the Civil War when the United States government tried to help rebuild the South and give the rights to the former slaves. In this section, you're going to see some new vocabulary words and also some repeat. Segregation, Freedmen's Bureau, shelter, legal, sharecropping, tenants, Jim Crow, and Ku Klux Klan. All of which we've talked about in some sense before, but this whole section is kind of dedicated to that whole idea of what is going on, especially with a minority population in our country in the South. So when Reconstruction was over, it was not popular with a lot of white people in the South. They did not like that the freed slaves were getting more rights, and they did not like that there was troops from the North in the South protecting the rights of these free slaves. They thought it was kind of intervening in the rights that they had to be there. President Rutherford B. Hayes is going to end Reconstruction in 1877. He was going to get a lot of pressure from people in the South who were angry about Reconstruction and how they were helping slaves. This is an image of President Hayes at that time. So the following shows the angry white Southerners burning down a Freedmen's Bureau school and harassing African Americans. This is the Harper's Weekly newspaper. So you see, like, the whole idea was, even though the African American was freed, they really weren't free from the hate and prejudice that you saw in the Deep South. So why were these people so angry? First off, many white Southerners were angry that freed slaves were getting all the rights for many reasons. During slavery, white Southerners thought black people were not equal to them. All right, white Southerners were afraid that with all these rights, black people would take over politics and make their lives bad, basically vengeance for how they were treated as slaves. So many white people in the South were racist or discriminatory. And one of the words that we're going to look at is discrimination, and it's defined as a different treatment or preference on a basis other than individual merit, meaning not for how we are or who you are, it's how everything else is acted upon that. So Reconstruction is done. The troops from the North were ordered to leave. The Freedmen's Bureau was shut down. There was no one in the South to make sure that newly freed slaves were guaranteed all their rights. So what do you think is going to happen to black people in the South after the troops from the North left and Reconstruction ended? Without protection from the U.S. Army and the help from the Freedmen's Bureau, African Americans are going to lose a lot of their power, meaning that everything that they fought for, everything we kind of worked through together, it's going to take a step back. Even though the rights of the people were supposed to be protected under the Bill of Rights and the 13th, 14th, and 15th, remember we called those the Civil War or slave amendments, African Americans were not given their rights in the South. So how did the racist Southerners take away the rights of African Americans? The first thing they do is they create something called Jim Crow laws, and we've watched a small video about that. The South created these unfair laws, and Jim Crow, they were laws in the South that were unfair to African Americans, and they were used to take away their rights. So how did they do it? They made African American pay taxes to vote. So why is that a problem? They made separate schools for African Americans and white people, but did not give money to the African American schools. Why is that a problem? They did not call African Americans to do jury duty. Why is that a problem? So you can see some of the stuff, some of the information here. First thing up here is a poll tax, meaning that every time they wanted to vote, they had to pay a tax. And if you were a poor African American in that period of time, it's going to be very tough because you don't have the money. They were also given older textbooks, so you didn't have the best information. Also at that time, you had an all-white jury. And what that was, meaning that if an African American was caused or convicted of a crime or charged with a crime, the peers who would be determined whether he or she was guilty were all white, which leads to a lot of problems, especially if you are a minority. So segregation is going to happen in the South, and what this is separate people. They're going to separate people by the color of their skin. The Jim Crow laws in the South segregated all public places, waiting rooms, schools, hospitals, hotels, and restaurants. You can see these are examples of Jim Crow laws that stayed into effect way later, into even the 20th century. You had white and colored restrooms, white and colored water fountains, help wanted but white only. So it was a way of the South to have systemic racism to make sure that the African American did not come up to the level of what the whites were. There was also a lot of scare tactics, and we've already talked about the Ku Klux Klan. It was a group that believed that the white people were better than black people. They used violence to stop black people from having their lives. The Ku Klux Klan would scare and stop African Americans from using their rights. They would kill African Americans if they wanted to use their rights to talk or publicize the bad things that were happening in the South to African Americans. And here's some imagery to see. You see on the top right is the custom white hoodie. At the bottom is burning crosses, and on the left is a tree, a hanging tree, for where they would try to hang African Americans who were trying to, again, fight for their rights. So I want you to be the judge, and you're going to be doing this in your journal. How did Jim Crow laws and groups like the Ku Klux Klan destroy all the things that Reconstruction was trying to do? So there's going to be a Supreme Court case that we're going to talk about. In 1896, the Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson upheld Louisiana law and the doctrine that was called separate but equal. And these facilities for African Americans, again, white and black, the ruling established a legal basis for discrimination in the South that is going to last for more than 50 years. While public facilities for African Americans in the South were always separate, they were very much far from equal. And these examples would be, again, the books and the taxes and the actual physical nature of the buildings, because people weren't reinvesting money into that idea. So what happens? There's a lot of people who are going to respond. So the first person is going to be Ida B. Wells. I have her picture up here on the top. In the late 1800s, mob violence increased in the United States, particularly in the South. Between 1890 and 1899, there was an average of 154 lynchings executed by hanging without a legal trial each year. All right. So looking at that lynching, a lynching is to execute by hanging without lawful approval. In 1982, Ida B. Wells, a fierce young African-American woman from Tennessee, she launched a crusade against lynching. After a mob drove Wells out of town, she settled in Chicago and continued her campaign. In 1895, she published a book denouncing mob violence and demanding a fair trial by law for those who were accused of crimes, and by punishment by law as honest conviction. Although Congress rejected the anti-lynching bill, the numbers of the lynching decreased significantly in the 1900s due in part to the efforts such as activists as Wells. This is even coming up in 2019, where you have people who are bringing up bills still talking about how lynching is illegal or should have never ever happened in our history. The other person is Mary Church Terrell. One lynching victim had a close friend named Mary Church Terrell, a college-educated woman who was born during the Civil War. This death and President Benjamin Harrison's refusal to publicly condemn the lynching started Terrell on her lifelong battle against lynching, racism, and sexism. Terrell worked with women's suffrage workers such as Jane Addams and Susan B. Anthony. She helped to found the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. She also formed the Women's Wage Earners Association, which assisted African American nurses, waitresses, and domestic workers. She led a boycott against department stores in D.C. that refused to serve African Americans, and again became a part of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Another person to talk about is W.E.B. Du Bois. The Atlantic Compromise speech provoked a strong challenge from W.E.B. Du Bois, the leader of the new generation of African American activists. In a book in 1903 called The Souls of the Black Folk, Du Bois explained that no advantage is given in giving up civil rights, even temporarily. He particularly concerned with protecting and exercising voting rights. In the years that followed, many African Americans worked to win the right to vote and to end discrimination. The struggle, however, is going to prove to be a long one, meaning that even though all these laws are passed and these Civil War amendments, there's still so much happening that even for 100 years, we're still going to see struggling in the civil rights movement up until the current era.